So let's jump into the PMI-RMP review. And when we get done, don't forget, riskresponder.com is another layer of deep understanding that you want to tap into. If you go in there, you can watch the introduction, and this is a very robust assortment of ideas.
Through an overview of what this content outline is all about.
Yes, in our first introduction, if you listen to that, we talked about the structure of the content outline having domains, tasks, knowledge and skills. And there are 5 domains. These are the sorts of areas that a risk management specialist in the area of projects needs to be familiar with and practicing and skilled in order to pass this certification and, more importantly, to be an effective risk manager in projects.
PMI-RMP just stands for PMI Risk Management Professional. What exactly do you need to do to become an RMP? Well, first of all, you need to meet the eligibility requirements. So let's take a look at the eligibility, and then we'll take a look at the rest of this document. Go into the eligibility. You can see that you either have a high school diploma or a bachelor's degree. If you have an associate's degree, it falls into the bucket of the high school diploma as well. If you have a high school diploma or associate's degree, then you need 36 months spent in the specialized area of professional project risk management within the last 5 consecutive years. On top of that, you need 40 hours of formal education in the specialized area of project risk management. If you have a bachelor's degree or the global equivalent, you need at least 24 months spent in the specialized area of professional project risk management with the last 5 consecutive years. In other words, if this is 2024, you cannot go to 2017 to count your experience. It has to be recent. You also need 30 contact hours of formal education. If you attended a global accredited college program, then you need 12 months spent in the area of risk management and 30 contact hours of formal education. Those are the requirements. If you have any question about that, do let me know. But the second question I get is, what exactly is the syllabus and how does it differ from the PMP exam? Well, this syllabus is a lot more focused on risk, very heavily focused on risk. Everything in risk is fair game. The exam is broken down into risk strategy and planning, risk identification, risk analysis, risk response, monitor and close risk, and it yields the total of the 100% on the exam. So let's jump into the structure. You got tasks and enablers. Tasks are the underlying responsibilities of the project risk manager, and enablers are illustrations of the work associated with the task. So let's jump straight into domain 1, which is risk strategy and planning. In this one, task 1 is to perform a preliminary document analysis. So what you're going to do here as a risk professional is gather and review documents. This could include industry benchmarks, it could include previous lessons learned, historical data, and you need to determine and assign who is responsible for the preliminary document analysis, who is actually going to look at these documents and begin thinking risk, begin planning at that level. Secondly, the task 2 says assess project environment for threats and opportunities. Well, this is a no-brainer. We do this all the time. Even when you step out of the house to drive to work, you're always assessing the world around you. So this is just making it official, right? Take a look at the OPAs and the EEFs, understand what is at play. Are we in the world of agile, waterfall, hybrid, whatever? Analyze the different environmental factors to be considered. Are we using PESTLE, political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, I believe it is, or whatever that acronym means? There's PESTLE, there's TCOP, there's VUCA, and you need to know all of those. And then what a SWOT analysis is: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. So at a high level, you're looking at the environment, you're using prompt lists, you're using other things like your WBS to prompt where could a threat be? Where could an opportunity be? Don't be hyper-focused on threats without opportunities. Task 3, confirm risk thresholds based on risk appetite. Risk appetite is how much risk a team or a person is willing to take on to pursue an opportunity. A risk threshold is that level at which you need to report the risk to a higher authority, escalate the risk, or take some sort of action. So all of these definitions have to be understood before the exam. Establish a risk management strategy. What is our overarching strategy? For example, on one of my programs, an overarching strategy was get management involved once you find something that can kill this program. The strategies can be more intricate or they could be high level. Number 5, document the risk management plan. That's a no-brainer. Number 6, plan and lead risk management activities with stakeholders. Your stakeholders need to come along for the ride. So you got to plan with them and you got to make sure they are on board with whatever you're planning. Domain 2 is risk identification. This is what I call the CRE approach. You got to understand the cause, risk, and effect approach. So you conduct a risk identification exercise, of course, with subject matter experts, interviews, focus groups, and other vehicles. But the bottom line is you're trying to identify those risks, right? You got to examine assumptions and constraints to be done with this risk identification because you could have risks inherent in your assumptions and constraints. You also want to document risk triggers and thresholds based on the context and the environment. So a trigger is a warning sign that a risk is about to occur or has occurred. You want to develop the risk register, like I said, based on the CRE model. So many things need to be here. You got to analyze the validity of identified risks. You got to do a qualitative risk analysis. You got to do risk response planning, but you want to bring the stakeholders along for the ride. And then you got to decide where is the risk coming from, like the cause of the risk, who is the owner of the risk, what is the impact of the risk, so on and so forth. Then we move into the analysis proper. So right over here that we just covered, it's really more of the documentation of the risk in the risk register. But when you're done with that, you got to go to the next level, which is the analysis. So you got to perform a quantitative risk analysis, probability rating, impact rating, multiply those, you get a risk score, or you could go for something more advanced. You could use a scale of 1 to 10. You don't have to use a scale of 1 to 5. It could be something else. But the summary is you're going to estimate the impact of the risk on the schedule. You're going to do that from a qualitative perspective first. And you ask, okay, will it have a big impact on schedule, a small impact on schedule? And then you got to go into quantitative that goes beyond the high, medium, low mindset, goes deeper into the numbers, into currency, into weeks, into tangible numbers, okay? Then we identify the threats and opportunities, like I said, by doing a SWOT analysis and so on. You would have already done that coming in here, but this is where you look at those risks that you might have identified and you try to better understand them in the analysis stage. When you have better understood these risks, you then move into the risk response, domain 4. And in the risk response, you're trying to determine an appropriate response to the risks based on what you know today, based on what you are currently aware of. Then you implement the risk response, right? You carry out the legwork, you do it, and you ensure that it is being done. You don't wait until the 99th hour. You actually do it progressively, and depending on the nature of the risk, you're going to elevate certain risks because of urgency and because you know you need to take care of them right now. If you don't, could be bad type of thing. All right, so this one, monitor and close risks, I think that takes us out. Monitor and close risk is just, first of all, gathering and analyzing performance data. 2, monitoring residual and secondary risks, risks that may still remain once you've taken action, or hopefully not this one, but offshoot actions that have emerged because you took action and then something else happens, right? Like a cascading effect. So you got to understand that when we look at the world of risk, there's risk responses, but there's also cascading effects, and then your response leads to something else, right? That's a secondary risk. And as a result of that, sometimes you don't have a comeback to that. So you got to think on your feet with the team and look for a way of getting around that. Provide information required to update relevant project documents and monitor project risk levels. And this, again, is something that you should do all throughout the processes. Okay, and there we are. We're back at where we stopped, and those are the domains, 5 domains. They're very straightforward. Let's look at them one by one, and I'll explain them at a high level. Risk strategy and planning, strategizing and planning how to manage risk on the project. Risk identification, identifying the risks. Risk analysis, analyzing the risks. And risk response, planning your risk responses. And last but not least, monitor and close risks. So the one I might have jumped over a little bit, I actually didn't cover the avoid, transfer, escalate, accept, mitigate. That's very important, comes up here. Also didn't explain the enhance, accept, share, exploit, escalate. I didn't talk about those. Those also come into play because this is not just about the negative risks, this is about positive risks as well, opportunities. We call them positive risks. Okay, that's that. All right, and we've come to the end of the content outline. It's very quick, very, very quick, but you can download the outline, read it for yourself, grab the PMI standard for risk management, make sure you read it, get solid on that, and before your test, close the gaps. Close the gaps. If you got any questions, put them in the comments below.
Are you looking to learn more about risk management as a PMP or a PMI-RMP aspirant? Do you want to know about risk from a real-world perspective? If so, you need to go on down to riskresponder.com. You'll be able to watch 2 risk experts tackle the topic of risk management from a pragmatic perspective based on a previous risk outline, but very relevant today. I'm talking about the curricula that was put together by Dr. David Hillson and I. Back in 2018, we embarked on a 2-day training program, which we distilled into 4 hours and 38 minutes, and we tackled everything in the risk outline at the time. A huge wealth of experience was brought to the table from Dr. David Hillson, who is known as the Risk Doctor, and we combed through everything to do with risk management, domain by domain. In fact, I dare say that this distillation of the risk content is the best for this exam in 4 hours and 38 minutes because it gives you a very pragmatic idea of what risk is from the lens of the PMI. Now, today we are going through the risk management professional content outline that was updated for the current exam. I'm going to walk you through what exactly you need to know for the PMI-RMP exam. But don't forget, this is just step 1. You need to know more information. If you have a degree, the PMI wants you to have 30 hours of training. This could be part of your 30 hours of training. So go on down to riskresponder.com, sign up. I would highly recommend focusing deep, taking notes. And as a result of you going through this program, you'll have a much more robust idea of the topic of risk management. Because risk is really huge on the PMP exam, but beyond the PMP, it's even bigger on the RMP. So going into the RMP, you need to understand the content outline and all the intricacies that are in it. So this was updated in May 2022. There are some differences, but the general idea of risk management does not change. So let's jump into the PMI-RMP review. And when we get done, don't forget, riskresponder.com is another layer of deep understanding that you want to tap into. If you go in there, you can watch the introduction, and this is a very robust assortment of ideas.
Through an overview of what this content outline is all about.
Yes, in our first introduction, if you listen to that, we talked about the structure of the content outline having domains, tasks, knowledge and skills. And there are 5 domains. These are the sorts of areas that a risk management specialist in the area of projects needs to be familiar with and practicing and skilled in order to pass this certification and, more importantly, to be an effective risk manager in projects. So the 5 domains are these. Domain 1 is risk strategy and planning. That's about understanding which direction this particular project is going to go in for its risk management. Then we've got, very importantly, stakeholder engagement. That's domain 2. Domain 3 is risk process facilitation, and that's actually making sure that the process that the project team follows is effective and works and delivers. The 4th domain is risk monitoring and reporting, so making sure that the process itself is delivering. And then lastly, the 5th domain is to perform specialized risk analyses, which are things that only a risk specialist would be able to do in the project. So those are the 5 domains, and I think we're going to start at the beginning. We'll talk about domain 1 first, shall we?
Absolutely. So risk strategy and planning. David, why is this in the Risk Management Professional Content Outline, and what should project managers be looking out for here?
Well, it's not project managers. Remember, it's the risk management specialists. And that's a key thing, and a lot of people are going to make exactly that same, not a mistake, just a refocusing. This is not for project managers, this is for the risk management specialist. So this is not project strategy and planning. Project strategy is the responsibility of the project manager, the project sponsor, and key stakeholders. But for the risk strategy and planning, then that's something that the risk specialist should contribute to. And so what we're saying here is that on the projects that have significant risk or significant complexity to need a risk specialist, and of course not all projects do, smaller, simpler projects may have risk tasks just undertaken by a member of the project team or the project manager themselves. But if your project is big enough and complex enough to need its own risk specialist, then the risk specialist is the one who can advise on what the risk strategy should be for the project. So projects exist. The reason we do projects is to take risk on behalf of our project owner, our project sponsor, and the stakeholders. What we're doing is we're saying, let's try and do something that's never been done before. Projects are unique and complex, and so we're taking risk by launching a project. And the whole purpose of project management is actually to manage risk on behalf of our project sponsor and our stakeholders. And so what we need to be sure of in each project is that we take the right level of risk. How risky is the project, and is that within the overall risk capacity of the organization? So we're not taking such a risky project that we might blow the whole organization out of the water. It needs to be within the overall risk appetite of the organization, and we'll talk about these things a little bit later. So the organization needs to have a view of how much risk the organization wants to take, and within that context, how much risk are we taking with this project? And then we need to match the risk tolerances of our stakeholders to the risks that we actually take on the project. All of these are strategic decisions. They're about the positioning of the project within the portfolio that the organization is undertaking. And the only person who's really qualified to advise on how risky the project is and whether that risk is acceptable is the risk specialist. So we need to take the right level of risk and then take the right risks safely. And the strategy and planning domain is about the first part of that, understanding what is the right level of risk to take on this project, and then planning to take that safely. The risk professional is best placed to understand which risk approach is appropriate and necessary for the project to achieve its objectives within the level of risk that is involved in that project and the available resources of the project team. So it's really important to see that risk strategy for the project is a key part of the overall strategic planning for the project, but there's a risk element to this which may require specialist input. And the other thing just to say at the beginning of this domain, domain 1, is that it's very closely linked to domain 2, which is stakeholder engagement. Because when we're devising the risk strategy, clearly we need to talk to our key stakeholders, to our project sponsor, to our senior managers, to our clients, to our users, and to make sure that the risk strategy that we set for the project is consistent with the level of risk that they want to take in the program, in the organization, for our clients and users. And so we need to engage our stakeholders clearly as part of developing the risk strategy. So we'll find some overlap in the tasks between domain 1, risk strategy and planning, and domain 2, stakeholder engagement. But here we're going to focus, aren't we, just on domain 1?
Domain 1, absolutely. So when we come back, we're going to take a look at the different tasks in domain 1.
Well, there you have it, my friends. You were able to listen in to the 2018 masterclass that Dr. David Hillson and I had. If you want to be part of that, go on to riskresponder.com, sign up, make sure you watch all the content, take notes. You're going to learn a ton. And then when you're done with that, coming in here, you'll have a much better understanding. In fact, this will look a lot simpler. And juxtaposing the change of domains, we don't have mention of the stakeholder domain anymore, but a lot of what we had, the specialisms that Dr. David Hillson talks about, they are now baked into these other domain silos. The previous domain, we thought the previous domain was really good and done from a more risk specialist standpoint. This takes that away. So when you dial in for our training, you're going to be getting a boatload of great information that is above and beyond actually what you have here. All right, so going down to riskresponder.com. Thanks for joining me today. Let's jump into the risk content outline, and then when we're done, we'll talk a little bit about the risk responder course again. So let's jump in to the risk content outline for 2022 review.
All right, my friends. So we're going to take a look at risk squarely. Okay, I'm going to use Excel to show you how the world of risk could work as someone in project management. So the first thing you want, we're going to create this tab here, and this tab is going to be called Plan Risk Management. And I'm going to share this, with our friends in the class when we get done. So Plan Risk Management, this is going to be I always talk about the 5 W's and the H, the what, when, where, why, and how of risk. This is really what we're after. We want to know, what are we doing by way of risk on this project? We're talking about our strategy. So what will our overall risk strategy be? Are we going to go after risks? Are we just going to fly by the seat of our pants? Are we going to have some specific events, that we carry out? What will our risk schedule, in other words, the events surrounding risk, look like? So this is going from just managing risk ad hoc to really having a plan, and then the when, how often will we meet to identify and discuss risks? The where is going to be, which meetings will this happen in, or events if you're in the world of Scrum. Why are we doing this? We could say it's high stakes, demanding client with a history, and it's our professional responsibility. A lot of people don't see it as a professional responsibility, but it really is. I often laugh at people who say, well, we don't have the budget, Phil. All of this it requires money. I'm like, just carve out a few minutes of your day with your team to talk about this, right? So you could have 15 minutes every week to discuss and address risk items, right? You could also have a dedicated meeting to tackle the topic of risk, right? And to update the risk register. So you as a project manager, if you're called onto a project to lead as a project manager, you should be having this discussion with your team, right? And then we have the who, and this is who is ultimately accountable, right? Which roles? Risk owner, risk action owner, etc. will be played on this project, because some projects have a dedicated risk manager, by the way. Risk manager. I remember working on with a well-known company in a weapon system project, and they had a risk person. They ran Monte Carlos. They were fully kitted for risk. So this is what you do in plan risk management. You answer the what, the when, the where, the why, the who, the how, right? Part of the how is going to include this. You're going to have tools, templates, plans. Right now, we're just planning how we're going to manage risk, right? So you're going to, when you talk about the what, you need to craft things like the risk probability and impact matrix. You need to come out with a format for that, right? Part of the how, you're going to have a risk register. Part of the how, you're going to have something called a risk breakdown structure. Part of the how, you're going to decide whether to use a risk score, expected monetary value, and the like. So far, everything we've done here is just planning how to manage risk. And I could go on and on for hours on end, just telling you things that you do in a risk planning meeting. This is really how we're going to manage risk, which templates are we going to use, which tools are we going to use, blah, blah, blah. Why don't we I'm going to open up our book here to give you some further risk context. It's a PMP exam immersion book. I'll tell you the page in a second. This is under the process domain. And this goes to, I believe is it 17? Maybe task 17. Let me see where task 17 is. Okay, so this is on page 248 of the immersion book. I'm just going to read. It says, page 249, it says there are 7 processes in risk management. Number 1, plan risk management. This involves planning how to manage risks on a project, planning how to identify, I should say, and manage risk. If you turn the page over, you're going to see the risk management plan. It says the risk management plan defines and documents how risks will be identified. So that's what we're doing. This is how our risk is going to be identified, analyzed, monitored, controlled, and managed. The risk management plan is essentially a document that explains how risk management activities will be performed throughout the project. So you're going to first of all create this. Now, after you've created this, you can then put all of this information that you're gleaning about risk into what I'm going to create here called a risk register. Okay. The risk register is going to have these fields, and I'll make it a very simple register, but it's going to have the cause, the risk, and the effect. So let me show you an example of a risk. An example of a risk could be boy falls down and breaks his crown. That's the risk, right? What is the cause? Mop bucket left in the way. What is the effect? Broken bones and a big hospital bill. Now, I'm kind of putting some of these in jest to make it more fun, but the idea is to not just identify the risk, but to identify the cause and effect. Does this concept make sense to you? Cause, risk, effect, right? Okay. When you're done with this, we could say all of this stuff here is identify risks. That's what you do in identify risks. You have to identify not only the risk, but the cause and effect. So that's going to be the first process after plan risk management. Okay, when you're done with this, you need to now do quantitative risk analysis. So you're going to ask, what is the probability rating? And what is the impact rating? And you could say the probability rating on a scale of 1 to 5, for example, impact rating on a scale of 1 to 5, for example. Let's say the probability of the boy falling down and breaking his crown is a 3. Let's say we put the probability as a rating as a 3 here, the impact rating as a 4 here. The next step is to find the product of both to get a risk score. And what is the purpose of the risk score? Does anyone know what a risk score is used for? What is the main thing it's used for?
The ranking of the risk, how probable they are to.
You got it, exactly. You want to rank the risk because you can't go after every single one on every single project. There has got to be some prioritization. So it's a relative prioritization. The risk score is the probability rating times the impact rating. In this case, it's a 12. So assuming we had a few other risks, and let's just put some numbers in here just for the illustration of it. So let's say we had a few other risks populated here. We would also have risk scores for those. And then we can prioritize, oh, the 16 is top 1, then the 12, then the 5. All of this, what we just did here, is known as perform. This is actually the qualitative, I'll just call it qualitative risk analysis. So when PMI say perform qualitative risk analysis, this is what they're talking about. You cannot take this same number and go to another project and say, well, it's apples to apples. No, it's not. It's different. You know, my project is going to be different from yours. 12 on my project could mean something entirely different. And that's qualitative risk analysis. Now, the next one is where we take the probability in percent, not just some number on a scale. No, this is an actual percent that you get from the experts, from the subject matter experts The people who have been there, done that, they can tell you what the likelihood of something is using expert judgment. Or perhaps there's industry records that show you what the probability has been over time for a certain event. Does that make sense? How you get the probability percent? It's not just a number that you throw out. It's something that you do with a lot of thought. So as someone who's been there, done that, you could have maybe a focus group where the probability rating, the probability in percent is talked about. You're not comparing this to the probability rating and doing a straight conversion to say, oh, it's a 3 in terms of the probability rating, so it's a 60. No, we want people to think more creatively, you know. So as much as possible, even just try to hide these so that people are not going to be, you know, swayed by what the rating is. That's the idea. But just for the sake of the illustration, we have the probability in percent and we have the impact in a currency. In this case, we'll put the dollar sign. My friends who are not in the United States, you use whatever currency you have, euro, yen, pound, whatever. But the idea is to have a percent. So assuming this was a 70% that was given by the team, 70%. Just remember that we could put this percentage in decimal. It doesn't have to be in percent. 70% is a 0.7. So just keep that in mind, whatever works for your team. And then the impact is going to be in dollars. So let's say Jack fell down, broke his crown. Unfortunately, he has a very poor health plan. But anyways, the company that's going to have to pay. So company has 550,000 bill. Jack has some serious problems. So if that happens, remember, we're just looking into the future and saying, if this were to happen and he fell down in this particular way, there's going to be clauses, penalties. When all is said and done, the impact is going to be this. We can then say the expected monetary value, EMV, is the probability rating times the impact rating. And what we're saying is this is the exposure for this risk event. If it did happen, right, just looking at the probability and the impact. Now, in reality, if this were to happen, it could be different, you know, because we're talking about 100% when it does happen. And of course, we're talking about something else. But the idea is that if we do this for every risk in our register, right, let's put some numbers there. If we do this for every risk in our register, the idea is that we're going to get to the point where the aggregate effect of everything all added up is going to help us to be able to deal with the risks that we are observing. And you wouldn't just do this for the negative ones. You could also do this for the positive ones. So let's go ahead and put what this is. This is quantitative risk analysis. Now, I want you to understand that even though some companies do this, it is rather primitive. This is really just showing you how everything pans together as far as data is concerned. But if you want to get a clearer picture of how risk works and the technicality of risk in the professional world, I would encourage you to go to this website. And maybe even beyond PMP, this could be a good source of risk inspiration for you. It's called palisade.com. They've been, to be quite honest, the industry leader in the world of managing risks using a quantitative approach. They create Monte Carlos, they have plugins for Microsoft Project, plugins for Excel, they have at risk for Microsoft Project, at risk for Excel. Just awesome work that they've done. They got a good body of work out there, and they got videos that actually show how quantitative risk analysis should be done. So this is really primitive. What I'm showing you here is pretty primitive, but it will help frame your understanding of what actually happens in quantitative risk analysis. So the idea, when all is said and done, when you've got the qualitative and the quantitative, you as the project manager working with the risk people, you can then come out with what we call risk responses. So we have the plan, risk, responses, right? And this is response, risk, response. And your response is either going to be a team for the negative or easy for the positive. So we're talking about, for negative risks, we have accept, transfer, escalate, avoid, mitigate. So imagine you had risk items here for all of these. You would have the option of choosing whatever strategy. Accept is doing nothing, transfer is transferring it to a third party, like insurance. Escalate means this strategy is beyond my stated authority, or this is beyond the project. It should be handled at the program level. Avoid is cutting off parts of the project or not doing the work. Mitigate is reducing the probability or the impact. So we have these 5. And honestly, that is majority of the story of risk management. When you have planned your risk responses, it would make sense for you to begin thinking specifically about who is going to do what. So we have another section here where we would have the names, the risk owner, and we will also have a section for the risk action owner. Who is the risk owner? Owns the strategy and affected objectives. Most of the time, your risk owner is going to be the person whose objectives are somewhat impacted. So it could be a stakeholder. Let's say you got a risk associated with the finance department. The risk owner could be the head of finance, for example. So you would actually have names, right? You have names of the people who are who are like the brain behind the strategy. So if your strategy or your objectives as a stakeholder are impacted, you could be the risk owner, but it doesn't have to be that way. The risk owner could be anyone who can best come up with some counteractive measures. The person who thinks about how to counteract, and the person who is now responsible to ensure that that risk is taken care of. The risk action owner is the person, he or she, who does the actual legwork in the response. So these are terminologies that you're not going to find readily in the PMBOK guide. You'd have to read other literature like the risk practice standard and other information for you to really get the language of risk owner, risk action owner. So let's say Uche's objectives are affected, or he just knows how to handle this risk because he's done so many bridges, and he says, Phil, this is what the strategy is. This is how we're going to work on this risk. You are going to be the risk action owner. Then I would do the legwork, right? I would do the legwork. And so on and so forth. So you would have actual people whose names would be assigned to these things, you know. So all of this stuff is still under plan risk responses, but I'll just say that part of the PMBOK guide talks about a risk owner very early. It talks about a potential risk owner as early as in the identify risk section. So when you're early on here identifying the risks, just be aware that you very well could be thinking about who the risk owner is, you know, very early on. But that's what we do in planning the risk responses. And you will have a status column for the monitor risks. Monitor risk. This is really status. And it's really just to check up and make sure that the risk responses were adequate. If they were not adequate, why? And asking, are there any new risks to add to the list? So this is where you will have some categories such as open, closed, in progress, and really depends on your company's configuration. Open means this risk could still happen. Closed means it can't happen, or it has happened and has passed. In progress could mean it's happening right now. It really depends. So we could have open, closed, in progress, and so on and so forth. And in monitor risk, again, this is going to happen all throughout the project. It's not just in one place. So those are your 7 processes. Plan risk management, that's planning how you're going to manage risk. Some of this stuff that we said we were going to use, we did use. So you plan risk management, then you identify the risk, cause risk effect, then you perform a qualitative risk analysis, then you perform a quantitative risk analysis, you plan risk responses, you implement the response, right? And you could have notes as well that say poor implementation, failed to include the relevant agencies in our strategy. It's a lesson that you've learned, and things such as that. That's how it works. Did that kind of help give you some further clarity on how, because I wanted you to see how it all comes together so that there's no confusion in what the PMBOK guide says, because it's very easy to read the PMBOK guide and blow past all these steps and not even be able to imagine a single one of these steps. Yeah, so let